Much of what we learn about science, nature, and the environment happens outside of school and beyond the walls of museums, zoos, and nature centers. I have worked as an independent environmental professional for many years and know there are others like me who interact with the public in communities worldwide. On the Talaterra podcast, we discover who these professionals are, what they do, and how they create change. Why do I focus on independent professionals? I focus on them because they move freely through communities. They move freely between schools, organizations, businesses, programs, and other informal learning environments. They are positioned to meet the public where they are, and this is powerful. Thank you for joining us today. I'm your host, Tania Marien. My guest today is Jeffrey Ryan. Jeffrey is the author of Appalachian Odyssey and Blazing Ahead. In his latest book, This Land Was Saved for You and Me, Jeffrey introduces readers to 7 people who were key to forming and preserving America's public lands. Jeffrey tells the story of how these individuals influenced each other and worked with each other, and who they met during their careers. He writes specifically about the contributions made by Frederick Law Olmsted, Gifford Pinchot, Benton Mackaye, Theodore Roosevelt, Bob Marshall, Aldo Leopold, and Howard Zahniser. I just love the story that Jeffrey tells, and the history too. It's the kind of story that my brain likes because it helps fill in the timeline I have floating around in my head. I enjoyed discovering who knew whom and who crossed paths with each other before and after they became well known. We'll begin today's episode by learning about Jeffrey's first book, Appalachian Odyssey. This book took 28 years to write, and it inspired his other books and his documentary series about America's conservation heritage. Let's join the conversation. I'd like to provide a bit of context for listeners. Your first book was published in 2016, and it was about your experiences on the Appalachian Trail. I read that it took you several years to write. What was the motivation behind your first book?
Oh, gosh. I had done a lot of long-distance hiking. The first trip I took was Mexico to Canada in one shot. And I got back from that in 1983 and started dabbling around with the Appalachian Trail with a friend of mine. And we didn't realize we were doing the whole thing until a few years into it, doing little pieces of it. And then one night in the tent, he turned to me and said, we might as well just keep doing the whole Appalachian Trail. And I burst out laughing and told him, you have to be crazy. This will take us 30 years. And he said, so what? And I had a revelation when he said that. I said, my gosh, he's right. So what? And we just kept plugging away. And 28 years later, we finished the trail in Georgia, 2,189 miles.
Wow.
And by that point, toward the end of it, I had decided to write a book about it. There were so many great stories around that 3-decade adventure that it really needed to be told. So that's what really started the whole thing. Mm-hmm. And it became Appalachian Odyssey, and that sort of got me off and running in the authorship part of the story.
Wow. Your current book is called This Land Was Saved for You and Me. And because of your extensive hiking experiences, you, without a doubt, write from a perspective that few others have. I love the history. As I said earlier, I love the research. Research is just so exciting to me. When did you start to write this book, this particular book?
Well, this book was an outshoot. So the second book I wrote was called Blazing Ahead, which is about the history of how the Appalachian Trail got built. And the reason I wrote that was having done the whole trail, I realized that these places that we love always have somebody or some organization behind making them possible. And so I developed a real appreciation for the two principal characters that developed and built the trail. And that sort of became a theme with me as I sort of moved around and looked for other subjects to write about. Benton Mackaye was the guy who came up with the idea for the Appalachian Trail, or if you live in the South, the Appalachian Trail. And so after the trail was built, he had a falling out with his partner that had built the trail, Marien Avery. And part of the falling out, a great deal of the falling out, in fact, had to do with the advent of automobiles and their incursion on wilderness and conservation areas. And so the direct fallout of that was that Mackaye and several others, a handful of others, started the Wilderness Society. So I took a deep dive into those founders of the Wilderness Society and found some common threads in the conservation realm, and started out to do a Finding Your Roots version of conservation history, and found out that it was so complex that there were so many intertwined roots that it became more an exercise of what I call Spock playing three-dimensional chess on Star Trek. It was way beyond what I could easily do, but I did find enough threads to find some compelling intertwinings and handoffs through that 100 years of conservation history. And that's where This Land Was Saved for You and Me came from, was those handoffs and insights that I had into that 100-year span, which I found fascinating and hope the reader does too.
I can tell you it is very interesting, and there's so much information. I was wondering just how complicated it was to piece this story together, because you cover a whole bunch. You touch upon so many different topics. You touch upon landscape architecture. You touch upon the field of forestry and trail construction, the establishment of the Forest Service, and the tensions between conservation and business, back then, which really looks the same as it does now. The formation of the national parks, and then this pendulum swing between parks and inviting visitors and then wanting to keep spaces unpopulated, and then as you said, the creation of the Wilderness Society and wilderness spaces. It is so many layers to this story. It's just an amazing job that you were able to piece all this together. And
Thank you.
It's really amazing. What is really striking to me is that a lot of the conversations that we have today, like I mentioned, about business and conservation, about attendance at parks, cars in national parks, visitors, and all the types of conversations we have today were happening back then. And it was really interesting to see how those conversations started, to see how the Forestry Service started, and the things that they were thinking about back then. What struck you about the politics of the time, the conservation movement at the time, and the business world, the economics during that period? You probably had lots to choose from, lots of different ways you could take this. How did you decide on which angles to take?
Actually, interestingly enough, the characters took me there. I had been aware of Olmsted, starting with him as the developer, the creator, the brains behind Central Park. But I had no idea that he was so involved in the ethos behind Yosemite and how you had this really interesting juxtaposition of a space that was built in an urban environment to offer people access to nature. And on the other hand, you had this place that had largely been not accessed by anybody, very few people, Native Americans and a few early arrivals out there in California, but, largely not so, but there was the insight that that area should be saved. And when Olmsted wrote about the need for that area, he was very aware of the fact that we needed nature, that in the case of Central Park, he was bringing it to the people. In the case of Yosemite, the people would eventually get there, but it needed to be managed and protected in 1864 when Abraham Lincoln gave the land to California, initially as a state park. So you sort of had this idea, and he wrote very eloquently about the fact that we need nature for our well-being, no matter what our environment is that we're in from day to day. And then the second chapter of it is really the forests and what were happening to the forests after predominantly, as Olmsted was getting elderly, and the use of trees, forest land, was rampant. And so you had this sort of wave of people cutting trees starting in the Northeast and heading mostly west. And it was a feeling that everything was inexhaustible. The birds were inexhaustible. The bison were inexhaustible. The trees were inexhaustible. And so this is where those voices for, hey, maybe we shouldn't be doing this so quickly, and look at some of the consequences of what we're doing. So there were a few voices that were profound, but not necessarily building to anything yet. Strong enough to influence some people to get into forestry, but not yet strong enough to enact forest management. And so that needed to build. So politically and economically, there were a lot of pushes and pulls over about a 40 or 50 year period that ultimately culminated in the creation of national forests and management of them, which was finally seen as a needed thing. And then the third chapter was really the Forest Service employees that were largely hired by the first forester, Gifford Pinchot, who realized that we had parks, we had forests that were being managed. Now the third piece was we need places that are, as Howard Zahniser said, untrammeled by man, and able to be enjoyed.
Yeah. Every individual who you spotlight in this book it's very focused, very determined, and really does everything with intention. And I think the one who stands out most that way to me is Gifford Pinchot. He was very intentional about everything that he did. And he kind of leaves the impression that he was very, I don't know, just very direct and very, I don't know, maybe not easy to communicate with at all times, but definitely knew what he wanted and was so key in pushing forward.
Pinchot was the right person at the right time. And I think what's really interesting is in this book to me is that those major characters were really important and revered, and to a greater extent well known. But it's sort of like a healthy forest itself, that the people who came early sort of laid the groundwork for the big trees to grow there. That's why I'm really fascinated by people who were before their time, like Franklin Benjamin Huff from upstate New York, who quit his medical practice to travel the United States and take a 600-page inventory of the trees that were growing throughout the United States. Just phenomenal for somebody to do that. And talk about someone living their life with intention. He just did what he felt needed to be done without a lot of fanfare, and got noticed as a result of it, but did not set out to become, like Gifford Pinchot set out to become, the head of the Forest Service. He just set out to make it known that we needed to manage the forests and save the trees. healthy stands. Fascinating character.
Yes. And that's what I love about your story is that these are people in the background. These would otherwise be invisible. And as you mentioned earlier, that's something that we share. We're drawn to those invisible stories, and wanting to share them with other people and spotlight their good work and give them the attention that they're due, for sure, and the credit that they're due. It's just really amazing, the stories that you tell. Another thing that comes across, or that I thought of when I was reading your book, was that for every one of these 7 people who you spotlight, how many more did you have to leave out?
Gosh.
Where there was actually a record of them, their presence, what they did.
Many. I'd probably at least 15 to 20 more. And they were like meteors that shot across the sky. They were not embers that glowed. They were people who showed up and made very persuasive arguments at certain points, or profound statements about the need for conservation, forestry, parks, whatever, and then sort of faded back. I wouldn't say into the background necessarily, but when they made their comments, they were well noted and well covered. It was a period in which there were an enormous number of newspapers, and they were the primary vehicle for getting the word out. Those and some of the horticultural and forestry magazines, the nascent ones, and people were eagerly awaiting to read about people's speeches and whatnot. So there were people like Huff, like a guy named Schurz, who had been in the federal government and gave a number of speeches about forestry after he was ousted by another administration coming in. What I found interesting was how, particularly in New York, how merchants became involved in saving forest land because of the effect that clear-cut forests had on watersheds and the unpredictability of things like the Erie Canal being reliable. What was happening, because all the trees were being cut in the Adirondacks, was that the canal was either overflowing or underflowing. And so the merchants were afraid that the railroads would be their only choice and thought, that's not good. Our prices for shipping goods to market will go through the roof. So the number of people from the urban environment that signed on with managing the forest was an interesting learning for me. I never realized, and it makes sense, that there is an economic benefit to managing resources that we often don't think about, particularly in that era.
How many other instances do you recall that maybe didn't make it into the book, where those realizations occurred between business and conservation groups?
Not many. In that particular case, I was able to find some examples of flooding in the Pittsburgh area that had caused great damage and economic damage, and also a textile mill in New Hampshire that had been flooded out and 3,000 people lost jobs, which was an enormous number back then. But also, interestingly, the tourism part of it as well. In the White Mountains, there was concern, particularly from the religious. One of the pastors in a very influential parish in New Hampshire made the plea in the newspaper that people didn't want to come from the city and go out and climb mountains to look down on clear-cut land, which was quite an insight. So it was affecting production, it was affecting transportation, and it was affecting tourism. And I think that all of those points, which we're all still concerned about today, came into play in terms of casting a big net for people to understand and be enthusiastic about protecting and managing our resources. Management is a big part of the story, and it's not, I think, it's also important to identify the fact that what people like Pinchot were angling for and Roosevelt was not to trample on the rights to harvest trees. They needed trees for our economy. It was about managing the forest, and that was something that took a while to take root with the forestry, with the lumber barons in particular. But they came to realize that it was good business sense to manage the resource to make sure it was still there.
Yeah, you spent quite a bit of a time talking about tourism, and I was thinking that could be just a book all by itself.
It could.
Yeah.
It could. It's important to so many economies. It's not, I think forestry, when we think of national forests, we immediately go to logging or mining in our minds, but they're really important recreation areas too. The management of those areas for activities like boating and fishing and hiking and mountain biking and, on and on it goes, is really an important asset for us to enjoy, all of us. And that's a big driver too.
Yeah. When I was reading about the issues with the conversations about the Skyline roads, and I was thinking about the one time many years ago I had got to drive through the Blue Ridge Parkway in fall. And that was so special. And then it made me think about, gosh, I wonder what the conversation was back then. And it was like hills of fruity pebbles. The colors were amazing. But I just loved so appreciate the opportunity to be able to see that. It was a thrill. I've always wanted to see fall colors because we don't have that here in California to that extent.
Right.
Yeah, it's such a treat. Such a treat. And a new appreciation that the road is there, that, we got to be able to do that.
Absolutely. It's a beautiful ride. Mm-hmm. And another big economic driver, right? No pun intended. There's lodging and gas stations and eateries and all that along the way. But it's also balanced with the fact that we also need freeways, and we also need back roads, and we also need hiking trails and all. The real fear with that part of the conversation was, at the time, there were 12 such skyline drives being proposed, and if all of them had been built, not only would the scenery be vastly different, particularly on the East Coast, but you wonder how much they'd be used. Probably large stretches of them would be abandoned because Blue Ridge Parkway is, 40 miles an hour for however many miles it is. And people have the choice of taking that or the freeway.
Every chapter, you put a different spin on something that was, was familiar. It rang, bells were going off all the time, which is good. And you are really, like I said, you are a fantastic storyteller. And I personally have a very strong interest in cultural interpretation, heritage interpretation. And I was wondering, have you approached the National Association for Interpretation about your book? Have you ever spoken with that group?
I have not, but that's a great idea. Absolutely.
They would eat it up. I can tell you they would eat it up.
It's really, really interesting that today we're talking about how so many people in this story were not demanding the spotlight. And I have been recently reading some Eckhart Tolle pieces where he says, if you want to attain a dream, the more you focus on the dream, the less apt you are to get to it. It's more about doing the daily work that needs to get done toward attaining the dream. So I think the example he used is if you want to be a millionaire and you focus every day on telling yourself the story of I want to be a millionaire instead of actually doing the work that it takes to become one ethically, then when and if you do get there, you will not have the satisfaction. And I think about that in a lot of different ways. It really hit me because a similar story is told in taking 28 years to hike the Appalachian Trail. But also I think when you look at people like Franklin Benjamin Huff or Schurz or some of the other people in the story, Benton Mackaye, he wasn't about this. None of them were about the spotlight. Even Aldo Leopold, who ended up being one of the most revered conservationists in our history, had no idea that the book he wrote was going to be posthumously this epic, second only to Thoreau book. He just did the work, and a lot of it. It really resonated with me. I think that part of the story, we love the rags to riches story told in a little sound bite, but it often is not those people that deserve the applause, as much applause. The people that helped get them there, or the people who were doing it and quote unquote got discovered later, are really fascinating to me.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Absolutely. And I'm just thrilled that you wrote this book because it's very good. And so I encourage you to reach out to NAI because I really think they would love this book. You've been, connected to public lands, or you've experienced public lands over several years, the trails and the history. And what have you seen change over the years in terms of public lands and parks and how they're managed and how the public interacts with them?
In recent years, I've seen a lot more people coming back to the parks. For a while there was the 70s backpacking boom, and the 80s were fairly active. And then things kind of cooled off for a while. And then the pandemic came and everyone, quote unquote, rediscovered the outdoors. And one of the things that I'm concerned about, and a lot of outdoor professionals are, is I think there's a disconnect between people going into the outdoors and not leaving anything behind except footprints, taking only pictures. That used to be the mantra. And most of the wildlife professionals I've spoken to and some of the things I've seen indicate a certain lack of respect for those areas that really is disheartening, has been. And fortunately, I've seen the pendulum start swinging back again toward people taking better care of it again, which makes me feel better about it. All is not lost. But I think anytime a place is impacted that much, I think you're going to see some of that. And it's just little things. And my philosophy is, even when I'm out for a walk in an urban environment, if I can just pick up that one gum wrapper or fix something or throw away a piece of trash or something. If I'm out on a trail, I bring a plastic bag with me. And it doesn't seem like much, but it makes a big difference. And it helps other people not see it and rationalize adding to the problem. But that's been a challenge. I think the management of the resource is actually in better shape than it's been in a long time. I think, for one thing, the funding has gotten a little bit better, has improved for some of the backlogged things that need to be done. And I think there's some really innovative things going on, particularly in forest management, that had not been going on until the last couple of years, namely the conservationists and preservationists getting together to manage lands concurrently, working together to see that some portions of lands are protected and others are sustainably forested forever. I think that's a really cool thing, because up until the last several years, you were either on one side of the fence or the other, and never the twain shall meet. But now we're seeing the emphasis on working together, and I think that's marvelous. There are some really great examples of projects going on right now to get excited about.
In your research, have you noticed any records to indicate the impacts of climate change, like the ranges of plants or animals, the home ranges, the way natural resources were available, and all that? Have you seen any changes in the research that you've done?
Oh, yes. Actually, this is really fascinating to me. So I went to an Olmsted conference. It was his 200th birthday this last year, and I went to a conference in Boston, and they had several speakers there talking about the Olmsted legacy, and trying to preserve his original designs in a number of landscapes. He directly or indirectly, through his sons and the following firm that had his name on it, impacted over 6,000 projects in the United States, which is mind-boggling. And they ranged from hospitals to college campuses to national monuments to city parks and national parks. But what was really fascinating was there's a lot of his plans were so detailed that they said this kind of tree here, these kinds of bushes here. He was a landscape architect, so of course he'd be that detailed. But the problem is, in many of the environments now, those trees are either dying or need to be replaced with another because climate change is affecting those landscapes. And there were a number of people speaking to how they did that. So how do you honor someone's original intent for a piece of land while accommodating things like climate change? These discussions are already happening. They're already making the changes. And to many people, they're going to be subtle because maybe they're the same species, but they're a little more heat tolerant or a lot more heat tolerant. So there are those kinds of things which I had never even really thought about till I went to the conference and said, wow, that's really interesting. They're trying to honor the design with what we have, what makes sense. And then certainly we're seeing other things, like we're seeing the range of things like sugar maples change and the projections of maple syrup availability moving incrementally up to northern Vermont and then Quebec only, and then what? So there are signs of that. And certainly this last year when I was hiking in northern Maine, it was in April, and we saw a week of 5 days in a row of 80 and 90 degree temperatures. You never saw that in April in northern Maine. And spring came earlier than ever. And that's been happening too. So it's there. It's changing. The glaciers in the Northwest, same thing. When I climbed those mountains in the 80s, there was a lot more glacier there than there is now. So we're seeing it.
Yes. How often are you able to go out on extensive hikes like you do? I mean, that's what you do. You still do that. You still travel quite a bit.
Yes, I as much as I can. This year I have a couple of at least 1 week hikes planned with my buddy Wayne, who's still at it with me. I think it's year 35 this year that we've gone for at least one trip every year, and we're still doing it. So it's pretty cool. these old guys carrying packs for hundreds of miles. So we're trekking away. And I had one of my other passions is I have a 1985 Volkswagen camper, and I go on my book tours in that. So I try to integrate 2 or 3 day hikes every once in a while in between my lectures to jump out of the van and go for a walk, so I'm not always driving.
So nice. So nice. Now, when you travel, do you keep a journal? Do you collect data as you go, pamphlets? I mean, all of that? You have boxes or bags filled with information?
All of the above. I have my current writing studio is filled with books and pamphlets from old trips and guidebooks. I'm a guidebook junkie. I have guidebooks to, I think, almost every hiking trail in the U.S. and maps. So when I get bored, I take them out and start dreaming about where do I want to hike next. But my ultimate goal is I'm moving to a piece of property in western Maine and building an exact replica of Henry David Thoreau's cabin, which I will use as my office.
Wow. And you will be doing this is a DIY project for you.
It is. I'm going to, I won't hand hew the beams. I won't cut down the trees and go to that extent, but I'm going to build, have the beams delivered and then build the rest of it. I have a Maine sourced lumber operation that's working with me on the lumber, and a blacksmith who's working on the hardware. So even the hardware for the door hinges and handle will be blacksmith like in Thoreau's day. I want it to be as authentic as possible.
Oh, amazing. So I assume you will be documenting this for a book
or
yes. For your videos,
yes.
doing videos.
All of the
wonderful.
Above.
All of the above. Oh, that's fantastic. So let's talk about your videos. You have, I'm going to call it a series, a documentary series, where you highlight people, specific individuals. You call the series "Voices of the Wilderness." You have on your website completed episodes, and you also have some that are coming up. How many voices do you think you'll capture?
Oh gosh, it depends. I have about 15 chosen right now, and I'm actually working on film 3, closing in. That one will be about Ernest Oberholzer, who lived in northern Minnesota and was instrumental in saving 75 million acres of wilderness. Another one of those unsung heroes, very affable, very sought out for his advice, but very insulated. He lived on an island in northern Minnesota and had a tremendous influence from this little enclave. Senators, statespeople, the Ojibwe tribe were among his best friends. He was just a very popular and sought out man in that part of the world and beyond. He actually became one of the founders of the Wilderness Society. They sought him out. I've already done Leopold and Howard Zahniser, who was the mover and shaker in getting the Wilderness Act passed. And I'm working on a Rachel Carson one too, because she is another one of those people who was so dedicated and almost thrust into the role of being the champion for the birds and for getting us to stop using DDT. And it's interesting. She initially did not want to take that project on, but realized nobody else was going to do it and became a hero because of it. And there's so many like that in conservation realm. There are many of us, many people working in conservation who are doing similar things. And it's fun. It's fun to connect and energize from each other.
Yeah. And might there be an episode about Jeffrey Ryan one day?
I'm too modest.
Well, what if
someone else will have to do that one.
Yes. No, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm serious. But yeah, absolutely, it should be included in that series, I think.
I'm too focused on telling other people's stories, but I have to tell you one story that didn't make it into the book. It just absolutely blew my socks off. And I was working on the book, and I was really hyper focused on this project, this land. And I needed a big whiteboard. The one thing missing was a whiteboard big enough to kind of map out how I wanted to tell the story. And so a friend of mine owns an advertising agency, and I went over there and said, "Can I use your whiteboard?" And he said, "Sure, have at it." So I'm sticking stuff up on the wall on his whiteboard, and he comes in and looks at it, and he's somewhat wowed by all these little threads I'm trying to connect. And he said, "I don't mean to add to your pile of things to do, but you ought to read this book about Rudyard Kipling, who was living in Vermont when he was writing the Just So stories." So I said, "David, I don't have time to read that. It's so off task. I just can't do it." And he kept trying to get me to read it. And he finally said, "It's a quick read. You'll be done in 2 days." And I said, "All right." It's a book called If. And, of course I bought it, got it on Kindle. I read it, and I'm reading it. And in it, it said, well, Kipling was waiting and his family were waiting to have their house built in Vermont. They were looking for a cottage to rent, and one opened up, and it had just been rented by a playwright named Steele Mackaye and his family. And I just couldn't believe it. It was Benton Mackaye's father. So Benton Mackaye was living on this country road in Vermont, and 2 weeks later, Rudyard Kipling's family moved into the same house. And I just thought, this is just one of those things in research where you don't even intend for something to fall into your lap, and lo and behold, there it is.
Oh, you see, and that's what makes it fun.
Yeah.
It's fun. All those surprises, they're such gems, and I'm not even going to share how many gems there are in your book, because people need to stumble upon them on their own when they read your book. Yeah, it's really,
hopefully.
Yeah,
thank you.
Really wonderful part of the story. I so appreciate you being here today and talking about your book. Your book, especially, I think now really provides. Not only is it exciting to hear how all these different people knew each other, what they worked on, and what we have today because of their time and effort. And it really, at least for me, provided a moment of reflection to really think about where we came from, what we have now, and where we need to go. And it's humbling because we take things for granted, like the Forest Service, but that didn't exist. There was a time when it didn't exist.
Right.
There wasn't anybody to manage the national parks, and you take us back there to those key moments.
And we also, thank you, we also can stand to benefit from revisiting the fact that they went through many of the same issues that we're debating and trying to solve now. And the way they went about it was really interesting. One quick example would be Pinchot, when Teddy Roosevelt sent him out to sit with the loggers who were vilifying him, and asked him to go talk to them. And he did. And they came to a really good place. And if they had stayed in their corners and continued to hurl insults at each other, they would not have gotten to that place. And I thought, some things never change. We can learn a lot from that. There's more in common, that we have more in common than not. And I think it's really easy to lose track of that and sort of hop on board with that kind of thinking. And we need more people willing to sit down and look at the problems holistically and see what we can accomplish.
What's next for you?
Oh, gosh. I don't know. I have a few irons in the fire. I'm certainly committed to continuing to work on my films. That series has been really fun, and I want to make sure that I keep giving that some energy. I'm dabbling around with a couple of other book concepts right now, so I'm not going to commit to any out loud. When I'm ready, I announce my intention to then make myself have to do it, to follow through. So that's kind of my style. So when I feel like I have enough fodder there, I will, I'll share that. But for now, I think, I continue to love to, obviously speak on the topic and, continue to research ideas for the next one. The story is the thing. Figuring out what I want to talk about and then be the best way to tell it. And once I get that fuse lit, there's no turning back.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for your work. I'm definitely going to read your other books because this was absolutely wonderful. My introduction to your work. And thank you for being here today. And thank you for everything that you teach us through your work.
Thank you for having me. It was wonderful.
To learn more about Jeffrey, his books, his documentary series, and where he's speaking next, visit the links in the show notes. And if you know anyone who enjoys visiting our public lands, please share this episode with them. Thank you for joining us today. See you next time.